All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Annette Roth, and I am the Community Development Manager for the Washington State Arts Commission. With me in the background, the man behind the curtain is Michael Wallenfels, who is our Communications Manager for the agency. And he's going to be in the background sort of helping run tech and taking questions for folks. So if you need to, Michael, you want to go ahead and say hi?
Hi, everybody. Great to be here with you. Like Annette said, I'm here in the background making sure the technology runs smoothly. If you are having a problem, feel free to shoot me a direct message in the chat and we'll workshop it, but hopefully everything goes smoothly this morning.
Great. And then Michael's also going to be on hand to take questions in the chat. So if you have questions or comments, you can feel free to put them in the chat. We are going to hold questions until the end of the session. So that way we left space for Q&A for folks. So again, welcome to this first in a series of 3 informational webinars about building for the arts and also how to get a building for the arts or a capital project off the ground. So we are going to begin the program here with a brief overview of the Building for the Arts program and how it works. And then we're going to spend the majority of the time today talking about project feasibility and how to get your organization prepared to do a capital project. Some of you may recall last year we did a webinar series in conjunction with the Department of Commerce talk about preparing for Building for the Arts. And at that time we found a lot of folks were new to this process and we're in the very, very beginning stages of starting a capital project. And so that's who this webinar series is geared towards. Some of this information for those of you that have been through this before may seem familiar, but our role here is to help organizations kind of get a jump on their projects so they are able to get them going in a way that makes sense. And so they'll be able to apply for Building for the Arts as they can, as their project moves. So, we are here at the Arts Commission and we work in partnership with the Department of Commerce, who is the grant administrator. And so we do outreach on behalf of the program. And so since we have a pretty direct connection to arts and culture organizations, particularly in rural and smaller and underserved communities, we have that connection. And so Commerce has asked us to help them make sure that this program can be dispersed equitably across the state. So, as part of our community development work at our agency, we want to ensure that we can provide as many services as possible to our constituents so that arts and culture is accessible and thriving in all corners of the state. So let's talk about what Building for the Arts is. It is a Washington Department of Commerce grant program administered by their Community Capital Facilities team. So we have some folks from Commerce on the line with us today. I don't know if you want to go ahead and just raise your hand or use the hand feature so that people know that you're here. Wanted to say a shout out to them and to thank them for this partnership. They will be able to, I see Sarah raised her hand, so welcome Sarah. They're going to be able to answer specific nitty-gritty questions about the program. After this is over, we'll make sure that we can provide contact information for me and for folks. So if you have very grant-specific related questions, they could go to the Department of Commerce directly. Now, Building for the Arts is a competitive grant program that awards nonprofit community-based organizations up to 33% of eligible capital costs to acquire and for major new construction or renovation of arts and culture facilities. Now, this is specifically for arts and culture facilities, such as performing arts centers, arts museums, or cultural facilities. History museums and community centers are not eligible for this particular grant. There are other grants that are out there that exist for historical museums in particular. So the maximum grant awards for this current round of funding is $2 million. So that means that any one organization could receive up to $2 million in grants for a project that they're working on. But the great thing is that there is no minimum grant amount. So even if you're working on a project that isn't $6 million, let's say it's a few $10,000 or $100,000, you're absolutely eligible for this program. Now, the program is available for tribal entities and nonprofits registered in Washington State. There are a few other requirements that you must have in order to be able to apply for this grant or to be eligible for it. Your nonprofit organization, must have binding control of the site, meaning that you either own it or you are a long-term leaseholder, long-term meaning 10 to 15 plus years. You want to make sure that your organization has a legally constituted board of directors. You have to decide if you want LEED certification for your project, which we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a few minutes. It's the projects are required to pay state prevailing wage for folks who are working on the projects. And also your organization needs to have demonstrated that you have made substantial progress in your capital campaign. So in making sure that you have funds available for the project. Now, let's talk a little bit about how matching funds work. So in the current law, the cap for funding for this program is $18 million total for all grantees. And the grant match can provide up to 33% of eligible project funds. Right? So basically what that means is for every $1,000 in grant funds that you are requesting from Commerce, you have to have $3,333 in matching funds available to cover the costs of the project. And we will talk a little bit more about funding later today and very much cover funding in webinar number 2, which is going to be next. So this is a reimbursable grant, which means that you don't get advance payment for the project. So you will have to submit invoices for steps in the process or for parts of the project that you have completed, and you'll submit them to Commerce, based on sort of your grant contract with them, and then they would reimburse you for those eligible expenses. Every biennium, the program has to go before the governor and the legislature to get refunded. That's just the way that capital project grants work here in Washington State. And so for this upcoming fiscal biennium, which is for fiscal years 23 through 25, so starting in July 1 of this year and ending on June 30 of 2025, this is in the governor's budget. Right now, the legislature is in session, and this is moving through the legislature. So we'll know the final amount of funding that's available for the program when the legislative session ends, which is, I think, in the middle of April. And so this whole project that we're talking about and what we're working on is to help prepare you for the next round of funding, right? So for the next fiscal biennium, the grant will open for application next spring. So in about a year or so, a little bit more than a year from now. And so this will give you time to start planning your projects to see, if you'll be eligible for the next funding round. All right. So we're going to talk about how the grant process works in very generalized terms. The Department of Commerce does have a lot of information on their website about this program. We do too as well. If you go to our website, you can find that information. We'll provide links to all of you in a follow-up email after the fact with links for all of the, application guidelines for the current fiscal biennium or for the one that's upcoming, right? And so there are a few steps in the process to making sure that you are eligible and could receive potentially a grant, and so the first thing that you need to do is make sure that you are eligible for this program and that you are ready to apply. It's a very competitive process, and they look at, like I mentioned, projects of all sizes, large and small, but the organization needs to demonstrate that they're ready to make this happen. Okay, and so making sure that you meet all of the eligibility criteria is going to be the first thing you want to do. And then while you're doing this, decide if you want to seek LEED certification or exemption. So LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, and it is energy efficiency standards for construction. And these projects are they're required to follow LEED Silver, so it's a specific level of certification, or take exemptions. There are some exemptions that do exist, for new construction or renovation under 5,000 square feet, or acquisition without construction. It's not an exhaustive list. There's a couple of other minor exemptions. We're not going to dive too deeply into this, but we want you to be aware that this is something that you would have to plan for in part of your application process, right? And then so once the application comes out, of course, you would complete the application form in due time. And then all applications that come in go through kind of a two-part process of review. The first one is a preliminary review to ensure that all the eligibility criteria is met, and that's done internally, an internal review from the project team at Commerce, and then the eligible projects go on to an advisory board that make recommendations for funding, right? And once those recommendations for funding are, they're presented to the governor before he or she puts out their budget, in December usually, and then it goes on to the legislature for approval or whatever the case might be. And then so once that happens, once all of the funding is approved through the legislative process, if a community organization is chosen, their project is chosen to be funded, they would enter into a grant contract with the Department of Commerce, for this project. And generally speaking, if you're funded, the project that you're being funded for should be completed within the biennium that it's funded for, right? That's just a good practice. Again, it is reimbursable, so you won't get funds up front, only after you've completed phases in the project, right? And the folks at Commerce will work with you in the grant process to figure out what those reimbursable requests might look like and what kind of a timeline there is for them, and how many reimbursements you may be able to take or when that's going to happen. So that's just a really basic overview of Building for the Arts. We're not going to spend a lot of time diving too deeply into the program today. We want to just give you a basic overview of the program, and we are going to continue in the other two webinars that we're doing in the series to provide basic overviews for BFA so you get familiarized with it. The specifics for the funding may change next fiscal biennium, that is to be determined. So we want to make sure that you are, following grant guidelines for the grants that are going to open up next year. Some of the things that we've talked about generally stay the same, but it's also important for you to do your homework and make sure that you're following the most recent guidelines, okay? So now that we have a basic overview of the program, we want to focus on your projects and project feasibility, right? And seeing if it's even possible to take your idea from idea to reality. So let's talk about, what is a feasibility project, right? A feasibility project basically determines how practical your project is. It's conducted in the very early stages before you really get into the project. And it looks at all of the resources that are needed for the project and what its likelihood of success is, right? So it's going to look at things like, what are the goals and the vision of this project? Is there community interest and need? What's the scope of work? What does project funding look like? What does the budget look like? What's the appetite of the agency that's achieved this to make this happen, right? And what are reasonable timelines? It's basically required, strongly recommended, required as part of the Building for the Arts project to have a feasibility study. Even if you don't ultimately apply for the grant itself, it's just a best practice to be able to have one for your project, because the reason why is you're going to be able to get a really solid understanding of all of the strengths and weaknesses of your proposal, of your project, things that are going to work, things aren't going to work, where you have weaknesses and where you can improve, and what are the things that you're going to need to look out for as you go through this process. So we're going to talk a little bit about who does a feasibility study, what that looks like, and how it's paid for. So feasibility studies can be done either internally or externally, which means that your organization can do the work or you hire a consultant to do it. There are pros and cons for each of these particular ways of doing a feasibility study. If you do it in-house, obviously it's low cost, right? But it is a huge amount of work to manage, and there's a lot of risk with that, right? One of the major risks with it is that you might not have the expertise on your staff or on your team or with your board to do it well. And so there could be a chance for fundamental pieces to be missing, right? Or you're not going to get a holistic view of all of the things that you need to do, right? And it is a lot of work. Obviously, a pro of that is that your team would be really invested in and be very knowledgeable about the process and the project. So that could be an option. Another option is to hire it out to a consultant, which is, a best practice and what we recommend. You get what you pay for. I mean, and if you're hiring a consultant, their job is to take a look at this in a very holistic manner. And so in order to do that, you are going to create an RFP, which is a request for proposal, or request for qualification, RFQ, that's another term you might hear, to get through this process. And so basically what that is a way that you put out a bid for information to hire a consultant to do this. And there's a number of things that you'll be including in this RFQ or RFP. You want to be able to include a summary of your needs, an introduction to your organization and a background of yourself and your project, what the goals and the project scope are, what your budget is for the feasibility study. It's the job of the feasibility consultant to figure out what the project is going to cost itself, right? Minimum vendor requirements. So that would mean something like if you specifically want to work with, consultants that are in your region or in your county or within Washington state, you can determine that in your minimum vendor requirements. For some organizations, that's really important to do. And so that's something you have to take into consideration is what is it that you need from the organization or from the consultant, where do you want them to be located? You also should include evaluation criteria. So how do you intend to evaluate the different proposals that you get? What is the submission criteria? What's the timeline? So when should folks be responding to this RFP? And when do you intend to just do the scoring? What's the scoring process? What are those scoring criteria? And when do you intend to announce, the selected consultant? That's going to be important for people to know. You want to make sure that you can include questions or section for Q&A if people have questions, or a way for them to get a hold of you during that period of time, and any kinds of terms and conditions you might need. And then what you'll do is, you'll do your homework and have ideally a group of folks taking a look at the different submissions and scoring them based on the criteria that you've already set, and then selecting a vendor. And when you're creating this RFQ or RFP, you definitely want to lay out the project and that you're requesting a feasibility study. There are services that exist that show you how to do that online. If there are folks who have more questions about that, we could take them offline, or we could put you into contact with some folks who are professionals who do this for a living that would be able to help you figure out what that's going to look like, right? Because sometimes you might look and find template online, but it might not suit your needs. So those are some things to think about. Now, when we're looking at what is in a feasibility study, there are a number of components. And we're going to go through each of these in time. And so the components include a preliminary analysis, organizational readiness, a market or needs assessment, a financial analysis, and a project and funding timeline. The first piece of the feasibility study that we're going to talk about is a preliminary analysis. And this is going to determine if a project is even viable before it begins, right? The purpose of the consultant, if you hire them, or the feasibility team, is to really test the project vision. Does this make sense? Is there a true opportunity for this? Are we able to do this? Is this project a reality? Oftentimes people will have this idea that they want to do something, but they don't really have a strong understanding of what the scope looks like. And this is going to help with that, right? And this is kind of where it's go or no go. You might, during this preliminary analysis, find some, challenges or some gaps that need to be filled, and that's okay. But realistically speaking, this is the point when you're going to realize if it's feasible or not to be able to make your project a reality. The next thing that we want to talk about, and this is really important, is organizational readiness. So your consultant is going to do a 360 view of your entire organization, looking at, does your organization have what it takes to make a project like this happen? One of the things that I think sometimes gets not thought about is how long these construction projects take, especially if you don't have a lot of capital to begin them, right? So capital campaigns, which we'll talk a little bit about, take time. Construction takes time. It takes a long time to get from point A to point B. And does your organizational structure support that? Do you have a solid group that's leading the way, that are committed to seeing this whole entire thing through? Is your board committed, right? Is the board behind this? Because sometimes, you might have staff or folks who are doing the work that want to do this work, but if the board's not behind it, it's going to be really difficult to make this project fly, right? And so, they're going to assess all of these things in the 360 view and take a look at, again, what's missing, what needs to be filled. Is the organization ready to do this? And if it's not, what needs to happen in order for the organization to be ready to take on a campaign of this magnitude? The next thing that we're going to talk about is a market or needs assessment. And this is something that's really important, right? Is there community interest in your project? Not do I think that there's community interest, but is there actual data that's going to support market demand for this? It's not just build it and they will come kind of situation, right? Sometimes that works, but usually that doesn't pan out in the long-term way. One of the important things, particularly from the grant programs perspective, is that we are investing public funds into these projects. And so they want to make sure that these projects are viable, they're feasible, there's an actual need for them, and that the organizations and the facilities are going to be around for quite a while and that they're going to be managed well, right? And so, the consultant is going to look at that. They're going to look at the future potential of your market, right? Do you have what are you getting now? What does that look like now? And what could that look like in the future if you were to expand or build a new facility where there never was one before? What are the options for you? It's going to look, the feasibility study will look at your competitors. That's going to be really important. Are there competitors in the community? Are there other organizations that are doing this work? And it's not necessarily, to see, can they do it better? But it's like, what are they doing and where do you fit in within that particular market or that particular niche, right? And making sure that if a lot of investment is going into this particular project, that it's going to pay out in the form of sort of new markets and people coming to your shows or to your facility, whatever the case may be. And they also take a look at, what would happen if your organization didn't provide these services. If, for example, you didn't do the improvements, how does that impact your ability to thrive and your ability to provide services to community members, right? Because oftentimes, folks will find themselves in a space where, okay, we have reached our maximum capacity within this particular facility, and we need to expand it, we need to grow. And so there are costs to that, but there are also costs to not doing that. And so the market assessment is going to take a look at that and determine what the best course of action is going to be as far as that goes. Next, we'll talk about financial analysis. And so this one's going to be a really big part of your feasibility study. And it's going to take a look at everything from what is a reasonable budget? What's all of this going to cost? What kind of preliminary investment is this going to require? You know, if you're in the process of building a budget for this project and you do intend to apply for grant funding, taking a look at all of the requirements that exist for various grants, like, you know, for example, with Building for the Arts, knowing that LEED certification may be required depending on what your project is. And also prevailing wage requirements are built into the grant process. You need to make sure that you know, take that into consideration and you add those kinds of costs to your budget, right? And if you're looking at other types of grants, which when you're doing, you know, this financial analysis, they'll probably want to do some research about what are the different types of funding mechanisms that exist out there. There might be other requirements that you have to fulfill in order to be able to apply for specific grants. And so, you know, this is going to be really important. This financial analysis will be a really important piece of your capital funding and of figuring out what your timelines are going to be. And again, like I said, in next week's webinar, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So, you know, one of the things that they'll want to know is if you have any initial investment for this project. Do you have funds set aside for capital projects in your organization? You know, if not, is there a possibility that you can have those? You know, if you need additional funding, where is that going to come from? How are you going to find it? You know, are you going to do a capital campaign? You're going to look for grants, right? Like Building for the Arts or other types of grants. Maybe there's local grants in your community or county that exist that you could tap into. What kind of public funding mechanisms exist? Are you able to get public funding from your local jurisdiction or your local county? You know, if you're in a tribal community, can you get funding in the tribal community? Those are oftentimes a way to do that in public-private partnerships, you know, depending, can be a good option. You know, are you going to look at private donations? And if so, how are you going to go about doing that, right? How are you going to raise the match for grants or for other funding sources? All of these things are going to be an important part of this financial analysis, and it's going to look different for every single project, right? So if you're building a brand new facility from scratch and you need to do land acquisition and, you know, engineering and design and building and all of that kind of stuff, that's going to be very, very different than if you are, you know, replacing the exterior envelope of your organization or the roof or doing seismic retrofit. There's something as part of a larger sort of envelope project. And all of those things are going to need to be taken into consideration as far as right. So we also want to talk about timeline and what is realistic. And so when you're looking at your timeline, it's going to be important to think about phases within your project. So you have, you know, your planning phase, your design phase, your funding, capital campaign phase, and also the construction and build phase. And all of those different phases have different timelines. Sometimes they overlap with each other. Sometimes you'll be doing some construction on a phase and then raising money for the next phase, right? Sometimes you'll be looking at all these different things. And so making sure that you're able to determine what the project phases are and what the lengths of these projects are going to be will be important, especially when you're looking at how to raise funds to coincide with the various timelines for the various parts of your project. Now, again, some of these phases you can access funding for through Building for the Arts, but some of them you can't, right? Like, so for example, the feasibility study, which is the preliminary, does this project is it even reasonable or pencil? That's not something that you can look for with, you know, for Building for the Arts or for a lot of, you know, large construction type grants. Some of them will, but most of them don't. You also want to think about how you can leverage this for grant availability. So for example, we know that with Building for the Arts, it is on a biennial basis. So every 2 years is a new round of funding. And so if you're planning a project, where would you be if you're just starting now? Are you going to be ready in a year from now to be able to apply for any kind of grant funding? And if so, what phase of your project will you be in? If you don't think that you're going to be ready, then you extend that out to know that you'll have to go to the next fiscal biennium. So 2 years after that, are you going to be ready at that point to be able to access some of that capital? Knowing these timelines and being able to stick to them as much as possible is really important, obviously, because you don't want to miss a window of opportunity. What's tricky about this, though, is timelines shift, and it's always important to add extra time into a phase just due to things that are outside of our control, right? So things that we can't control include permitting process, weather, supply chain issues, global pandemic, for example. All kinds of things are beyond our control, and it's important to recognize that these things exist as part of your planning process. Now, the project feasibility could take several weeks, could take a couple of months to get through this, and that you would be working really closely with your consultant, or your project planning team would be working closely with the consultant to be able to determine all of this. And a person who does a feasibility study for a living is going to tell you all of the pieces that you're going to need. They might have to do market research and all kinds of things to go through this whole entire process, right? And so the timeline exists not just for these different phases, but the totality of the project from the very beginning. And when you get the feasibility study, you're going to get a report, and it's going to include a number of things, such as an overall summary, an executive summary, a strong project description, technical analysis, which is going to talk about, the sort of pieces that you need, architecture, engineering, technical analysis of the site, if you need some of that. What are all of those pieces that you need to have in order to move this forward? It will include a market analysis, and that market analysis is going to be important for you as you go into your capital campaign. You'll have an organizational structure and readiness report that will let you know where you're at as far as your organization goes and how you're going to be able to move forward through this. The timeline, of course, is going to be built into this as well, so you can see what you're looking at and where you need to go, and also financial projections and recommendations for the project. Now, all of these things are things that you're going to have to think about as you enter into this. Some of you might be partway through this kind of process, or you might be getting into this project feasibility stage, and that's great. And some of you are still thinking about this. You recognize that you need to improve your facility, or that you need a facility somehow in your community, and you might not know where to start. And so the whole point of this is just give you an idea of these are the things that you're going to have to start looking for and thinking about before you even get into the process of let's build this, or let's get the funding for this project. Okay. And so we're going to stop here and take some questions if folks have questions, or if they have comments. I'm not sure, Michael, if any questions were put into the chat. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Nothing in the chat yet, except for some questions about whether or not we'll be recording this presentation and sharing it later. And the answer is yes and yes. We are recording, and we will host this on our YouTube channel and our website. Excellent.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. Yeah, so, we know from just, someone, Rob says, does a BFA project have to qualify under a LEED certification? Can you provide a little bit more context to that question?
Yeah, just wondering if it has to be LEED silver, LEED gold, or does it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So LEED silver is the qualification standard currently. I presume that will be the case moving forward, but that may not be true. And so if things are going to change, then you just have to make sure that that is there. So what are ballpark costs for feasibility studies? That's a great question, Jenny. They range, so it depends on, I mean, it depends kind of on the size of your project and also what your budget is for this, right? So, you know, that, which is, I know, I recognize a non-answer. You know, the question is, I mean, I would say $1,000 is not enough. $1 million is way too much. You know, but tens of thousands might not be unreasonable to think about for a feasibility study, particularly if you're looking at an extremely large capital project. If you're looking at a big construction or big renovation, you know, there's going to be a lot of work that goes along with it, you know. So it kind of depends on what the size of your project is going to be. But that's a great question. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Or does anyone have like, if they're in a place in a project and they want to just kind of talk through that, we could certainly do that as well. All right, well, hearing nothing, we are going to go ahead and give you back a little bit of time in your day. So thanks for joining us. We're going to be doing another webinar. Oh, someone's saying, we know we need more space, we don't have a project yet. That's, so do you want to talk a little bit about that, Joanne?
Sure.
Okay.
We've been looking at, you know, a different facade on the building, and we're just starting to gel some ideas. So how would a feasibility study fit into that? I mean, would you be doing a feasibility study to figure out what your project is first?
Well, I mean, you could, or a lot of a feasibility study for that would even be thinking about this, and that would be this would be an example of a smaller feasibility study if it's just something that is only the facade improvements. Is like, what does that look like? How much is that going to cost us? What, you know, what is the purpose of this facade improvement? You don't want to take those things into consideration, because if a facade improvement, say, let's just say, is going to cost $500,000, but it doesn't really make any improvements to the functionality of the building or the return on investment, so the ROI on spending that money on the project doesn't pencil it in a reasonable time, it might not be worth it, or it would help you to figure out what is reasonable, right? So you might have ideas about a facade improvement that might be overkill or more than you need. And so the purpose of doing a study like that is going to determine if that's reasonable or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but we wouldn't be seeking one of these grants to do the feasibility study. That would be on us. Yeah.
Yes, Building for the Arts does not fund feasibility studies. So because it's not construction related. It is, you know, sort of trying to even determine if this project is realistic or not. So the funding of a feasibility study, you would have to find funding for it either out of your own, you know, if you have funds available at your organization, you know, it could be like capital costs. You could put that in a fund for capital costs. It might be possible for you to find, you know, funding from another foundation, or, you know, have somebody sort of donate funds for a feasibility study.
Yeah.
Tom, it looks like your hand is raised.
Yes, I have a question about the LEED certification and how that might apply, or if it applies to building improvements. So if we were to get a building, you know, space in an existing building donated for $1 a year, but it needed major improvements to be usable. Is there a threshold for the LEED certification requirement in terms of how much dollar value that improvements have to reach, or how does that work?
That's a great question. I'm going to turn that over to our commerce folks because that is a little bit more technical of a question than I feel comfortable answering. So Sarah or Beth, if you guys are here, if you want to answer that question, and if they're not here, we can get information for you, Tom.
Sure, thank you.
Great.
Yeah, so regarding the, this is Sarah Alway with the Department of Commerce. I manage the Building for the Arts grant program over on our side. So regarding the LEED certification requirement, there are a limited number of exceptions that we're able to grant regarding the specifics of the project. So you can actually, if you go to our website, we do have our LEED certification form on the website, and you can take a look at the form. There are just a couple of quick questions where you can pretty easily tell whether your project may or may not be an exempt facility type, or whether the LEED standard may not be practicable for your project. These things have to do with the amount of square footage that your project is, whether it's renovation or new construction, how far along you are in the design process and things like that.
Okay, did that help answer your question, Tom?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
And
Great.
Tom, I dropped into chat the link that Sarah was mentioning, so you can go ahead and take a look at that form, and anybody else is welcome to take a peek as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, and then there's a question here. Does this grant put any liens on property owned or rented? I don't believe so, but Sarah, you might want to clarify that.
So depending upon the amount of the grant, we do securitize grants that are above the $250,000 range. And so on those, we would put in trust either a leasehold deed of trust and a promissory note, or a deed of trust and a promissory note for the term of the contract, the 10 or 15-year term of the contract, and that would be released at the end of that compliance period.
So is it released at the end of the grant project being complete, or the leaseholding time of 10 or 15 years?
The term of the, so our expectation is that the facility will be used for the its intended use for the entirety of that period. So those would remain in place. And Beth, if you're on here, correct me if I'm wrong, but those would go for the 10 or 15-year compliance period.
Okay. Thank you for that. Looks like we have a hand up. Charlie? If you're speaking, we can't hear you, Charlie. Okay, maybe he's not there right now. Charlie, if you can hear me, and if you're there.
There it is.
There
For
you
some
go.
reason, it was
Okay.
not going through. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Feel free to ask your question or comment.
Great. My apologies for that. My system keeps popping in and out. For two parts. One, first of all, historic buildings and LEED certification, automatically a consideration, more likely to have an exemption?
That's a great question. I mean, I believe Sarah can verify this, that, I mean, there's space requirements. So if it's under a certain amount, then you can get an exemption, like 5,000 square feet or less, you can get an exemption for LEED certification. There are some not practicable exemptions, but that's not well defined. So that's more of an odd case by case basis, where I think they would take a look and see what you're talking about and help to provide you with additional resources. And so the idea is to get and try to understand that as early as possible in the process, so
Right.
you're not in the application process trying to figure that out.
Yeah, perfect. And then the second part was, it is certainly possible for us to break down the variety of components of the greater project into smaller bits. but the process of shutting down a theater for a period of time to do the type of renovation that's required is such that it's probably easier if we do them all at one time. So I'm trying to figure out that balancing the overall needs of the project versus the likelihood of a smaller financial request being relative to a larger financial request, because like how much does the governor like to spread the money around as opposed to making big commitments for individual things? So yeah, I'm trying to weigh that in the process of just defining the scope of the project.
Sure, absolutely. And I know that, the further along that you can get in your funding, making sure that you have all of your funding that you need, your match secure, your project planned, all of that kind of stuff is going to, that looks good, right? And so that is one of the criteria for funding, not the only criteria, of course, but that definitely is something to take into consideration. And yeah, that's a great question, because it's like, if you do it in phases or you're shut down for 9 months, for example, that's 9 months of revenue that you're not able to take in, and how are you going to sustain things over time? And again, that's what some of that those feasibility studies are going to take a look at that and try to determine what that looks like for you guys. I mean, that's the project consultant's job, is to help for those kinds of things.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Sure. And then, so Peggy's asking, how far back can we go for match? I think, Sarah, this last round was back to 2019. Correct me if I'm wrong, but, so a previous fiscal biennium, it's, adjusted a little bit here and there each year, but, you can generally go back a couple of years for that.
Right.
Okay. That was a great question.
We also have that question from Jenny that asks, how does an organization go about finding companies to get feasibility study bids from? Is there a recommended list?
Oh, that's a great question. So, there's a process that you can go for putting out requests for proposals. There's various organizations that you can list your project proposals on. Some of them, they're sort of construction project sites that you could use. If for government agencies, for example, there are, you can bid that on sort of various, I think it's called webs or something like that, where you can put that out there. And then it's just a matter of, we even have seen, so I'll just give you an example. So an example today is there was an organization that is doing a feasibility study for a project, and they just did some research and found some various, construction and feasibility companies that that do that work and send it out to them directly. And I only know that because the company that the feasibility study was sent to is an organization that we do work with sometimes, and they asked us if we had additional information about the project, which we don't. So there are ways that you can find those different organizations to put the word out there. Can money received from other / past grants be counted towards our matching funds? That depends on where the grants are coming from, right, Sarah? So is that correct? There's some grants that you guys have that you can't use as match, correct?
Correct. So any state funded grants cannot be used as a source for the BFA matched. But if a grant comes from another private source, then yes, we could include it in the project budget as an eligible match source.
Right. So basically, if you got a grant from your community foundation of your county, or something like that, or a nonprofit organization that provides grants, and the money is not from a state fund, then you could absolutely use that money, but not for state funds. And I think the requirement of not using state grant funds for other state grants is not uncommon. So that's just something you'll have to take into consideration. And so again, making sure that you have good financials and a good process is going to be key to make sure that you don't sort of double dip in that way. Will, it looks like you have your hand up.
Hi, Annette. Quick question. So we are people that I'm working with here have renovated Kurt Cobain's home and are in the process now of renovating an old building in town. We're going to have some ceremonies around it. It's going to be a Nirvana tribute center.
Okay.
Cobain, kind of a museum interactive place. And what I'm wondering is, I think I heard you say you could go back maybe to 2019. I'm just wondering if a project is underway like this, it's something that we could consider at least looking at the application for.
Well, again, if your project meets the other eligibility criteria, then, and making sure that sort of all of the eligibility criteria is met. I mean, you could, in theory, look at that. I mean, that there's no guarantee of funding. Obviously, you have to go through the application process, and the application process for the next fiscal biennia starts next year. So in basically like 14 or 15 months from now, so April-ish of 2024 is when the next round of funding is going to be available. And so I would suggest with that specific project, because it kind of is like, is it a community center? Is it not a community center? Who owns it? That would definitely recommend that you reach out to the Commerce folks directly and make sure that the project is even, eligible for this particular grant, because I don't know just on the surface of things if it would be, but I could be wrong. I mean, it absolutely could be, but I don't know that for sure.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Erin.
Hi. We are in the process of looking at a collaborative space. So working with a few different organizations to collaboratively build a project together. And I'm wondering how other kind of consortiums have applied for this in the past, if it's been a lead organization that applies on behalf of the whole building, or if we do decide to like condoize the building, if different orgs can apply for their own separate condominiums, or how has that been handled in the past?
That's a really interesting question. I do know that, there should be, partnerships are allowed under certain circumstances. The nonprofit organization should be the lead applicant. And, there's the notion of binding control of the site. So does everybody have binding control of the site? Does one organization have binding control of the site? What does that look like specifically? If an organization doesn't have like binding control, meaning they either own or have a long-term lease for the building, then they wouldn't necessarily be eligible. Again, I would say for your specific circumstances, reaching out to the folks at Commerce directly to answer that question, give them a little bit more insight or explanation as to what it is that you're referring to as far as that thing goes, would probably be the best course of action.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, we're still very early, still deciding how the agreement between the orgs exists. And so appreciate that.
Absolutely. And I know that there are other folks that have done things like that, where it's like, we're going to have a place and there could be space available for other organizations, but they would be subleasees perhaps, but there's an organization that is the main leaseholder, and that is usually the one that does the application. So Rob saying in the chat, just to clarify, there is no BFA application deadline this June. No, there is not. So Building for the Arts is on a biennial, so every other year. So last year, there was an application period that was open. So in the springtime of 2022, and then the projects recommended for funding were determined in October-ish of last year, sent to the governor for budget approval or to be added to the budget, or in this case, yes, it was. And so that's one step in the process. And then it goes to the legislature to take a look at. So Leg is in session right now, and they will make a determination when the final budget comes out as to how much funding goes for the program. Right now, the governor recommended $12 million. Hopefully the legislature will provide more, but that of course remains to be seen, and hopefully they will. And then after that, then the projects that were recommended for funding are notified that they were recommended for sure. And then they enter to the grant contract, and then they can start, you know, the reimbursable, the project and all of that kind of stuff based on the criteria and their grant contract and all of that kind of stuff. So we're looking at the future here. So all of the process and all the work that you guys are going to be doing is working towards the future for next fiscal biennium or the one after that. So hopefully that helps to clarify it a little bit. All right, that was a great question, Rob. Thanks. Anyone else? Okay, hearing none, I think we're gonna close down here just in just a second. We have another session next week that we're going to be doing, and we're going to specifically be talking about capital funding and timelines, and how do you plan your capital funding? What does that look like? How do you line that up with timelines and coming up with realistic timelines for funding your project from basically start to finish, right? So we're starting from new. We're doing this from the very beginning and going from there. And then the week after, well, on March 7th, we're going to have a round robin Q&A with a couple of folks who have successfully gotten Building for the Arts projects or funding for their projects. So you'll be able to hear from them directly about what their project is, that looks like, and you know, some of their experiences with getting funding and what their projects were and how the Building for the Arts money helped them, or you know, make sure that their projects were successful. Michael, I think just put in the chat that you can register for the other sessions. So go ahead and do that. And again, we'll send out additional email to folks on the line who were here with some of the resources that we talked about, so you have them easily accessible to you. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.